Kieran Mulvaney, welcome back to the program.
Thanks very much for inviting me back.
Kieran Mulvaney is a boxing analyst and the co-host of HBO's boxing podcast. Kieran Mulvaney has written several books that have nothing to do with the sport of boxing, but are knockouts nonetheless. To learn more about my guest, visit KieranMulvaney.com. Kieran, you were at ringside for the Sergio Martinez-Miguel Cotto fight this last weekend at the Madison Square Garden. Your thoughts on the fight and the performance of the new WBC middleweight champion, Miguel Cotto?
First of all, it's often a real privilege to be ringside and covering these fights, and Saturday was no exception. I've been really fortunate to have experienced some pretty amazing big fight atmospheres, and this was way up there. This was definitely some of the best atmospheres that I've experienced have all involved Miguel Cotto at Madison Square Garden, but this just went, a whole other level. Cotto, I thought, was sensational. He looked as good as I have seen him. Offense was outstanding. He was measured. It was disciplined, but at the same time, it was aggressive. His movement around the ring was excellent. His conditioning appeared to be superb. And the way he was able to segue from offense to defense and back again was much smoother than I'm used to seeing with Miguel Cotto. There has to be a slight asterisk, a slight caveat, which is that we didn't know going into the fight that there was a possibility that Sergio Martinez would be limited. He'd had knee surgeries. He'd been in a couple of tough fights. And that does appear to have been the case. I mean, he did not respond well to the punches from Miguel Cotto. It looked as if he could not move very well. He could not get the necessary torque on his punches, nor could he, get the necessary kind of base to withstand the punches that Miguel Cotto threw. So it was a bit of a shell of the Sergio Martinez who was in there. But nonetheless, Cotto didn't know that for certain before he took the fight. He took a dangerous fight, and he won it in emphatic style. Of credit.
Perhaps Sergio Martinez was never as good as we thought he was.
I think he was actually pretty good. I think he was a pretty darn good champion. Look, let's not forget the guy who scored a one-punch knockout of an iron-chinned Paul Williams. He decked Kermit Cintron with a punch that was so hard and so fast that both Kermit Cintron and the referee were convinced it couldn't possibly have been a punch. It had to be a headbutt. I'd never seen anything like that before. Up until, say, through 11 rounds against Julio Cesar Chavez, I think the decline with Sergio Martinez really began in that 12th round when he got hit and he hurt himself. He damaged his knee and his shoulder in that 12th round. He struggled a bit against Martin Murray. And then, there wasn't that much left of him by the time he fought Miguel Cotto. The sad thing I think about Sergio Martinez is that he wasn't, quote-unquote, discovered and brought over to the United States until he was 33, I think it was. 32, something like that. So he fought far too much of his career in the comparative boxing backwaters of Spain. And that's unfortunate. I think it would have been great to have seen him at his peak for a longer period. But I think, although we didn't get him for that long, I think he was a pretty darn good fighter. He was just a diminished one by the time that Miguel Cotto got to him, and Cotto showed why he's a Hall of Famer and dismantling Sergio Martinez.
Well, they say the last thing that a fighter loses is their power. But how does age affect a boxer's ability to absorb punishment?
Well, I think with Martinez, I think it's twofold, really. On the one hand, he's been knocked down a lot, even in his winning performances. In most of his fights that we've seen, he's gotten knocked down. To some extent, that's because he has a peculiar kind of balance. But I think in Martinez's case also, because his knee was so damaged, he was unable to brace himself necessarily, to give himself the kind of support. In order to take a punch, you got to be pretty sturdy from top to tail, and he just didn't have that ability to do that. And he got caught by a left hook very early on and was never able, really, I think, apart from anything else, to not only recover from that, but also to move necessarily to keep himself out of trouble. Cotto just kept stalking him and hitting him and adding to the punishment that he was taking.
Sergio Martinez reminds me a little of Roy Jones Jr., only in the sense that Sergio does not have the depth of fundamental boxing skill that is needed to carry a fighter past his physical prime. Once RJ slipped physically, he was done as a fighter. And the same can probably be said for Martinez.
I think it's an excellent analogy, actually, because, yeah, all the things that made Martinez such an effective fighter, his unorthodox stance, the way that he threw punches from all different kind of angles, ultimately proved to be his vulnerabilities. Freddie Roach, when I talked to him for HBO early on in fight week, he said, look, Sergio Martinez is a terrific athlete, but he's a terrible boxer. He just doesn't do anything right. And, of course, Martinez, as we know, was a soccer player and a cyclist before he became a boxer in his 20s. And as Freddie said, look, my guy, he's been boxing since he was 6 years old. He's taught more about boxing than any soccer player is ever going to know. And so you're quite right. He didn't have those fundamentals to fall back on. And he had lost a lot of his physicality. That was really what made him such an effective champion at both 154 and 160 pounds.
Do you give more of the credit to Freddie Roach's prowess as a trainer in transforming Cotto in this fight, or is it just Cotto himself?
It's both. I think the first thing is that Miguel Cotto realized that he could no longer be in charge of his own camp. You can't have a fighter in charge of his own camp, and yet Miguel Cotto had been the number one, the top dog in his camp for a number of years, for the majority, in fact, of his career. And you need to have somebody who, even though the fighter is the employer, the trainer is the guy who needs to be in charge. And it took Freddie Roach for Miguel Cotto to find somebody whom he trusted, with whom he was comfortable, who he could work with. The two clearly see eye to eye. What Freddie has done an extraordinarily good job on, I think, is giving Miguel a sense of contentment, satisfaction, and confidence back again. Confidence to commit to the offense that we used to see from him. And also, I think he's done a very good job in terms of conditioning. That was always a problem for Miguel. He would sometimes fade at the end of fights. And we haven't had much of an opportunity to see that he would or not under pressure with Freddie Roach, but he does seem to be much more confident in his conditioning than he has been in the past. A lot of beautiful movement and a lot of just pacing himself, and at a much faster pace than we've seen from him in the past. So I think it's a combination of the two.
You know, he showed great patience in that fight. He could have gone for the attack, the outright KO in round 2 or 3, but he was measured. He just wore him down.
That was the beautiful thing about it. He never got out of the pace that he wanted to set for himself. And that's always been Miguel Cotto's strength. He's always been at his best, a guy who would not fight outside of himself, if you know what I mean. He would have the pace that he wanted to set, and he would go about it, and he would do it, and he would break guys down. He is impassive and relentless in the ring as he is impassive outside of the ring. That is who he is, and he was quite emotional in the immediate aftermath of the fight. But in the fight, he was focused. He had the job to do. He wasn't going to get away from the game plan. He's a smart fighter as well as a skillful one, and he showed that very well indeed.
Have you ever met Miguel Cotto?
Yeah, certainly several times. I mean, over the last 10 years or so, I've been able to talk to him and interview him on a number of occasions. You know, certainly don't go out to the movies together or anything like that. But yeah, and I've always found him a pleasure to interview. Look, there are a lot of people who think that he is arrogant and distant and so forth, but for me, I've always found him a pleasure to deal with because he just is who he is. It's just that he doesn't feel compelled to engage in social niceties in which he doesn't necessarily agree, that he thinks are false. He is just, what you see is what you get with Miguel Cotto. And I find that quite refreshing. He's very professional to deal with. He's very straightforward. He has learned English to the extent that he talks, has interviews with English language reporters exclusively in English now, which wasn't the case 5 or 6 years ago. Yeah, I think he's a joy to deal with, personally.
You say he is who he is, and it reminds me of Iron Mike Tyson. Back in 2011, you did an interview with Mike Tyson, and if there was ever a guy who was more raw, more candid, more available as an interviewee, it's probably Mike Tyson.
Yeah, Tyson's very different, and I wasn't around as a fight writer while Tyson was a fighter. I covered his very last fight, his loss to Kevin McBride. But that was the only Tyson fight that I covered. But I did have the opportunity, as you said, to talk with him. And sat down with him for about an hour and a half, I think it was, maybe a wee bit less, for ESPN a few years ago. And yeah, he's very raw. He is very open. He has no filter anymore, Mike Tyson. He wants to, it's as if he's going through a lifelong cathartic process now. And he is extraordinarily self-critical. He is really quite open. The one thing that he didn't really want to talk about particularly with me was his boxing career. He would talk about pretty much anything else. But as he said to me, when I was a boxer, I did horrible, horrible things. I was a horrible person. And I don't like to think about what a horrible person I was then, so I prefer to just not think about it and not talk about it. So we ended up talking about a whole wide range of things, from pigeons to the revolution in Egypt to the nature of life and happiness. It was a very interesting and wide-ranging conversation. He's kind of an interesting guy.
Tyson's a lot smarter than anybody would have given him credit for 20 years ago.
Yeah, he's not book smart, but at the same time, he has the capacity to be book smart because the guy has an encyclopedic knowledge of boxing. I mean, my goodness, you can just about name anybody and he'll know all about them. But he's also, well, the guy's been through the ringer, you know. He's had all kinds of experiences, good and bad, that most of us can only imagine. And so he's a much wiser person than he certainly was 20 years ago.
Were you scared to be around him?
No, he's a cuddly bear now. From what I understand, at his peak, I talked to colleagues who covered him when he was fighting. He could be a piece of work, and he was not necessarily a very pleasant guy to deal with. But now, he's vegan now, he's at peace with himself, even as he works through his own ongoing issues. He's very, very outgoing and friendly, very humble. It was actually a real delight.
That Kiki's turned him around, eh?
Yeah, absolutely. No question. I think that has been a really, really big deal for him. It's been a tremendous anchor for him, very settling. He finds it baffling that anybody would want to be with him and would want to care about him. He finds that quite strange. But nonetheless, that's the way it is. And she does take care of him. And that's really definitely helped him settle down.
Back to the Martinez-Cotto fight. Would a prime Sergio Martinez have beaten Cotto?
I thought this Sergio Martinez was going to beat Cotto because even though I knew that there was always a possibility that his knee was not going to be strong enough to support him, I still thought that stylistically he has such fast hands, he is so rangy, he hits so hard. I thought he would be the absolute nightmare style matchup for Miguel Cotto. Of course, this isn't a prime Miguel Cotto either. It's hard to believe that it's not a prime Miguel Cotto because it's perhaps his most impressive performance of all. There have been times in the not too distant past where we thought Cotto was done too. But personally, I do think that at his peak, as short as it was, Martinez would have been a match for just about anybody, and I think he would have been a tremendous handful for Miguel, particularly because I think Miguel isn't even a very big 154-pounder, let alone a middleweight. And I was very surprised to see that he appeared to be so much the stronger man the other night.
Yes, he definitely has power. It wasn't Sergio Martinez's knee that started the whole first round.
No, it was that left hook to the chin. And full credit to Sergio as well, who could have made all kinds of excuses. Oh, I guess my knee wasn't ready after all, and I guess they should have taken a tune-up. He didn't say anything of that sort. He just said, Miguel Cotto caught me with the left hook in the first round, and I never recovered.
Where does Martinez go from here? Is he done?
I think he's done. Yeah, he goes from here to the Happy Valley retirement home for boxers. I just don't see him.
Not always such a happy home, from what I hear. I mean, these guys like to box.
Yeah, that they do. But I sincerely hope that Sergio, I'm sure he's feeling deeply unhappy right now and wishing that things had gone different. But it's very difficult to see what he does now. I mean, he's 38 years old. I mean, as you mentioned earlier, he doesn't have those fundamentals. His success had been predicated on his tremendous athleticism, which has deserted him. His ability to take a punch looks as if it has deserted him. He's a successful man. He's a very smart man. He's a very classy man. He's a hero in his homeland. And this will be a good time for him to get out and move on to the next stage of his life, and to do so, hopefully, with all the success on the class that he's shown as a boxer, I just don't see that there's a future for him. I know it's amazing, right? It's incredible how you can go from being the middleweight champion of the world to being completely written off.
And he wasn't even knocked out.
No, I mean, he wasn't, but he was badly, badly hurt by the end. He was in all kinds of trouble. I just don't see, I mean, I suppose if he wants to, he could probably still fight B or C level opposition and do quite well, but he's not going to be able to headline a pay-per-view. It's just difficult to see. I mean, I guess there could be some options for him if he wants to, but not at a championship level, not now.
I can't figure Cotto out, you know. I actually thought Cotto was going to win this fight going in, just because of the politics of boxing. Cotto is far more marketable than Sergio Martinez. He speaks English. He's just the bigger attraction. This is why he walked in first. But I thought he was shot after the Trout fight. Yeah. But now, just like you say, he's the legitimate linear middleweight champion of the world.
Yeah.
But let me ask you this. What was Miguel Cotto's prime?
There, I think the year right up until his first loss to Antonio Margarito, he was unstoppable. When he moved from 140 up to 147, and he was beating the likes of Zab Judah and Shane Mosley, he looked like a force of nature. That fight week before the first fight with Antonio Margarito, I really thought that Cotto was on the verge of becoming one of the top 2 or 3 pound-for-pound fighters in the world. And whether there was anything nefarious or not in Antonio Margarito's hand wraps on that night, and the reason that we suspect there might have been is because it was discovered that there was something nefarious about his hand wraps in his next fight, or whether it was just a bad style matchup and Cotto just walked into those punches. You know, whatever it was, that fight stopped Cotto being what he could have been, at least that period of time. There have been basically 2 times in Miguel Cotto's career that he's appeared done. The first time in the aftermath of that first Margarito fight against Joshua Clottey, afterwards, he just looked very, very vulnerable. He looked like he was pretty much done, but he worked his way back. He defeated Margarito the second time. Then he gave Floyd Mayweather a darn good fight. And then he just, as you said, he looked terrible against Austin Trout. And it looked as if, okay, well, maybe this is it. And that was the second time where it looked like maybe he was done. And then back he comes against Alvin Rodriguez, and now having perhaps this singular best performance of his career against Sergio Martinez. It is really quite remarkable the way in which he's been able to pull himself back from what seemed like the very end of his career on a couple of occasions.
Do you think it's possible Sergio Martinez knew he was shot going in? He was wearing the knee braces. That's something I haven't seen in a big fight before. And just cashed in on a payday with Cotto?
No, I think that fighters often have to go through all kinds of strange psychological gymnastics to convince themselves that they're in the best possible shape. You know, they have to convince themselves that they're vulnerable because they need to have that degree of fear and motivation, but at the same time they have to simultaneously believe that they're going to win. Martinez clearly knew it was an issue. That's why he was having so much physical therapy in the build-up to the fight. Part of him may have known in the back of his mind. I don't think he's the kind of guy to go through with something just for a payday. I think he's got too much pride. He has too much respect, I think, for his fans. I think he's a genuinely classy man. I think perhaps in the back of his head he suspected, but he wanted to go on. And had he just been there for a payday, he wouldn't have gotten up the first time or the second time or the third time, and he would not have been protesting so vociferously when Pablo Sarmiento said he was going to stop the fight. That was a really, really tough thing to hear that exchange in the corner.
You were ringside. Could you overhear that conversation?
No, what happened was one of the HBO production guys afterward, who was listening through headphones, came back and told me what exactly was going on with that conversation. And just told me just how difficult it was. That classic, Martinez going, give me one more round. I want to go out like a champion. And Sarmiento going, no, this is it. Your knee isn't working. Nothing's working for you. I'm going to stop this. I love you. And, I'm going to stop this. Just a really very difficult and sad conversation.
Yeah, that's a very difficult moment for any athlete.
Yeah.
The end of the road.
Yeah, and especially because for them, the end of the road for them happens at an age when the rest of us are kind of just starting to get into our prime to be one of the top, most physically capable human beings in the world, and being told you're washed up at 38, for heaven's sake. I mean, good Lord. You know, most of us are just getting into our stride.
What's next for Cotto? Is he going to unify the middleweight belts, fight Golovkin and Sturm, maybe perhaps go for a Mayweather rematch? Listen, he gave Mayweather the best fight of his life, even more so than Maidana, in my opinion.
I agree with you.
Now I'm hearing Golden Boy is talking about Cotto versus Alvarez. Now, whoever he fights, Cotto's a superstar now, right? With the exception of Mayweather, maybe Pacquiao, he's the main attraction. Yeah,
exactly. He's been, at least on this side of the Atlantic, he's been the number 3 pay-per-view draw fairly consistently for a while now, and that's only going to improve. If the other guy who is coming up on the rails, who might be challenging him for that position, is Canelo Alvarez. 2 weeks ago, the notion of a Cotto-Alvarez fight wouldn't have been possible because it looks as if Cotto is determined now to finish off his career with Top Rank, whom he's comfortable. And Canelo, of course, is with Golden Boy. But now that Richard Schaefer has left Golden Boy, and Oscar De La Hoya wants to and is open to doing business again with Top Rank, then Canelo, first of all, has to get past Erislandy Lara in July, and then depends on what his contract situation is with Showtime, but if he is able to fight on whatever network that he wants to, I can see a Canelo Alvarez Miguel Cotto fight being the biggest and most makeable fight. I don't think that Cotto is going to fight Gennady Golovkin because, in the words of my HBO Boxing Podcast co-host Eric Raskin, Miguel Cotto fears no man, but he is not an idiot. I believe that Cotto is the legitimate lineal middleweight champion of the world, but Gennady Golovkin is the best middleweight in the world. In many respects, the idea of a rematch with Mayweather makes absolutely perfect sense. Mayweather remains the champion at 147 and 154. Cotto's the champion at 160. It seems perfect, but again, if Cotto's going to stay with Top Rank, Mayweather has said he won't work with Top Rank for a Pacquiao fight, so he'd have a lot of explaining to do if he was suddenly prepared to work with Top Rank for a Miguel Cotto fight.
Let's look ahead at some of the fights that are coming to HBO. On June 14th on Boxing After Dark, and there have been so many great fights on Boxing After Dark. Of course, the great Mickey Ward, Arturo Gatti fight. On June 14th, we have Provodnikov versus Algieri. How do you see that one turning out?
Chris Algieri's not much of a known commodity for a lot of viewers. They might have seen him once or twice on ESPN. He's a very good boxer. He moves very well. He has tremendous skills. He doesn't have power. And on the one hand, it could be a very, very difficult style matchup for Provodnikov because I can see Algieri just moving and gliding around and making it extremely difficult for Provodnikov to catch up to him. But ultimately, against a guy like Provodnikov who's going to keep coming and keep coming and keep coming, who's going to put the kind of pressure on you that you've never experienced before, at some stage you're going to have to dig your toes into the canvas and cause him to give you some respect by hitting him hard enough to just, make him think twice before coming forward. I don't think Algieri has the ability to do that. I can see him frustrating and outboxing Provodnikov in the early going, but Algieri has to fight a perfect 3 minutes of every round. Provodnikov does not. Provodnikov basically only needs 15 seconds around to do his kind of damage. I see Provodnikov reeling him in and quite possibly stopping him. In fact, probably stopping him in the second half of the fight. But it's a very interesting contrast in style.
Crawford versus Gamboa. Gamboa, the fighter everyone loves to hate. God, I want to see that guy lose. That's on June 28th. How do you see this fight turning out between Crawford versus Gamboa?
Really, and again, a very intriguing clash of styles. Again, not that many people will have seen very much of Terence Crawford. I think he's been on HBO twice. But I think he is the business. Right? He's a beautiful, beautiful boxer. The performance that he put on when he went to Scotland to beat Ricky Burns and take his lightweight title was sensational. Again, not necessarily the most exciting of fighters, but a very, very skillful very skillful fighter. And I think Gamboa, who has all the talent in the world, but seems to have just thrown his career away over the last couple of years, he's not going to be able to do what he has sometimes done, which is just walk in arrogantly with his hands down and just look to fling the occasional fast, hard punch, because he's just not going to be able to do that against a boxer like Crawford. What Gamboa is going to have to do is do what he can do and work behind the jab, show his boxing skills and his fundamentals as well as some of his flashier moves. Otherwise, he's just not going to be able to catch up to Crawford. I could see it being a very frustrating night indeed for Gamboa, particularly because he hasn't been in the ring very much. I think Terence Crawford, particularly in front of his hometown Omaha, Nebraska crowd, will probably outbox perhaps the more famous, more favored Yuriorkis Gamboa.
So that's a bit of an upset. Yeah, he's not a well-known fighter, so perhaps a coming-out party for Crawford. Yeah,
a coming-out party. I think that's a very good expression, actually. I think it's definitely going to be that. Particularly if it is an impressive win, then I think people are going to realize that he really is a very good fighter indeed.
July 26th sees the return of Gennady Golovkin versus Geale. Golovkin, of course, has been on a bit of a break. How do you see this one turning out? Is it another KO for Golovkin?
Ultimately, but Geale's a tough fighter. He was last seen on HBO in a losing effort, but a sensational losing effort against Darren Barker. I think this is about as good a matchup as we could make for Gennady Golovkin right now after Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. basically backed out of the opportunity to fight him, at least right now. Geale's a tough guy. He's a good boxer. He's a real middleweight. He's probably one of the top 5 or 6 middleweights in the world. He's not going to fold easily. If he does, if Golovkin blasts through him the way that he did Matthew Macklin, it will be extremely impressive. You know, every time, Golovkin still has his critics. I'm not one of them. I think Golovkin's sensational. Before he fights Matthew Macklin, people go, oh, he hasn't fought a real middleweight. He destroys Matthew Macklin. It's like, well, he's not very good. Wait to see what happens when he fights a bigger guy who hits him back. And he does that against Curtis Stevens and demolishes him. Oh, well, Curtis Stevens isn't even very good either. Geale is a good fighter. He should provide him with a real test. I expect Golovkin to stop him, but late. I think Geale will give him some very tough rounds, will outbox him some rounds, will hit him in others. This will be a very good marker of just where Gennady Golovkin is. I expect this to be a very impressive performance against a very good opponent.
Who are some of the new up-and-coming boxers we should pay attention to? I see Shane Mosley Jr. is fighting now, which makes me feel very old at 35. Oh, my goodness. Is he for real?
I haven't seen anything of Shane Mosley Jr. yet. Yeah, outside of, I think he was on a 24/7 at some stage recently. But the one guy who more than any other, there are some nice young fighters out there, but I think the one guy who is really potentially going to be something quite spectacular is a Puerto Rican called Felix Verdejo. He has not yet fought on HBO except in some highlights. He's 12-0, 2012 Olympian. He has fast hands. He has power. He has tremendous boxing ability. He has charisma. He's a good-looking lad, a wonderful smile. He's learning English. He has Sugar Ray Leonard, Floyd Mayweather type potential all over him. We haven't seen him tested yet. What Top Rank is doing what it does so well, what it did with Miguel Cotto, what it did with Floyd Mayweather, what it did with Oscar De La Hoya. Bring him along at just the right pace, give him a little bit of a harder challenge each time before really letting him loose and setting him off into the deep end. We will start seeing him on HBO probably later this year and certainly during 2015. And I do believe that by 2016, Felix Verdejo will be one of the stars of boxing.
Kieran, you've been on the show before, and on our last talk, we did a what-if segment where I asked you who would win between Floyd Mayweather and Roberto Duran. You said if it's at lightweight, nobody beats Duran. Any other weight, yeah, Floyd Mayweather will win. You just mentioned Leonard. Just quickly, who would win between Mayweather and Leonard?
Ray Leonard all day. Ray, of course, is a natural welterweight.
Yeah.
Who moved up in weight. He'd be too big. He'd be too fast. Floyd wouldn't be able to do anything to him offensively. he'd be in his defensive shell for far too long.
Well, let me ask you this then. Who has more talent?
Has different degrees of talent. Defensively, Floyd Mayweather is a sensational fighter, one of the very best of all time. Offensively, Sugar Ray Leonard is, I think, by far the more talented fighter.
A prime Cotto versus a prime Tito Trinidad.
I think it's a terrific matchup. The disadvantage for Miguel Cotto is that he tends to break down his opponents over the course of a fight. What happened with him against Sergio Martinez was definitely the exception. He very rarely has come out firing and put his guy in trouble in the first round. Felix Trinidad was vulnerable in the early stages. He had this history of going down in the second round, but he would always come back stronger. I think that technically Miguel Cotto is a better fighter than Felix Trinidad. All you had to do was show a little bit of lateral movement to Trinidad and he'd be lost. But with that reach of Trinidad's, with that incredible right-hand power, Trinidad would just keep coming, and I think Cotto would have a very hard time keeping him off. And I'd have to pick Felix Trinidad, I think quite possibly by a late stoppage.
A prime Cotto versus Fernando Vargas, a prime Vargas.
I mean, that's just interesting because Vargas is a big dude. He's a very big dude now. But when he was fighting, when he was fighting, he's a big, solid guy. And he has some pretty good technique, too, and he's a good, aggressive fighter. You know, when he did step up, he lost. And you can make that same case for Miguel Cotto. But, you know, when Cotto stepped up, he stepped up against Floyd Mayweather and Manny Pacquiao, the two very best fighters of this generation. And as we said, you know, he gave Mayweather as tough a fight as Mayweather has had. And again, Vargas's peak was so small, really. Trinidad, of course, I think pretty much ruined him. But I see Cotto being able to take what Vargas could offer and just having too much. Vargas's conditioning was always very suspect, even more so than Cotto's. And I could see Cotto down the stretch against Vargas just proving too much and perhaps stopping him late in that contest.
You have a new show, HBO's Boxing Podcast, with your co-host Eric Raskin. Tell me about the show and what it entails.
It's about 30 minutes. It's most weeks, particularly the week before an HBO card, World Championship Boxing or Boxing After Dark or pay-per-view. And then we also have a recap show after the big pay-per-view. So we just did one after the Miguel Cotto-Sergio Martinez fight, as myself and Eric will break down the upcoming fight, look at CompuBox stats and see if that tells us anything about the upcoming matchup, and examine what the storylines are. We make predictions, which in some cases are horrifically wrong, and sometimes are a little closer to the mark. And you can find it on iTunes or SoundCloud, and it is called the HBO Boxing Podcast.
Boy, it must be pretty exciting working with an outfit like HBO.
Yeah, it's very cool. It's very cool, very enjoyable. You know, they give me a lot of opportunities, shooting a lot of video during fight weeks. Obviously, you get a lot more access to fighters and to other folks that you do, you know, with HBO. You never have to be part of that scrum of press conferences trying desperately to get a quote. I get what I need well in advance. It's a joy, and they're very professional. The production values of everything that HBO do is tremendously high. Any
color commentating in your future, Kieran?
I used to think that was a gig that I wanted, but I don't know, man. It's pretty hard.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I'm very happy with the role that I have with HBO right now, which is to be their fight week reporter. It's something that suits me pretty well. I don't have to pretend to be any more of an expert than I am. I just get to ask fighters questions and let them do the talking, and that's a role that I like quite a lot.
If the audience wants to follow you a little closer and perhaps even get in touch with you, how can they do that, Kieran?
I'm on Twitter, Kieran Mulvaney. That's always a good way to find me. So look for me there and listen out for our podcast. You can also find the Fight Week videos that we do, as well as blogs and fight reports on our HBO blog, which is InsideHBOBoxing.com.
Kieran, it's always great having you on the program. Thank you so much for being a guest today.
Thanks very much indeed for inviting me back, and let's do it again.